Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jenny, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here with you all. I want to thank you very much for taking the time today. I love talking to zoo docents and volunteers because y'all always have so many great questions. So please, I assume it's fine to put questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the talk, but I'm going to jump right in because I have a lot I want to share with you guys. I'm going to try and not talk too fast, but if any of you know me, you know that when it comes to talking about gorillas, I could do it for hours. So let me quickly share my screen. Hopefully we won't have any technology snafus. We did practice and it went fine, but you know how these things go. Let's see. All right. So I'm gonna hide this and show going. Here we go. If for some reason this isn't working, someone just jump on and tell me. But yeah, I'm very excited today to talk to you about some of the lessons that we've learned from 5 decades of mountain gorilla conservation. And Jenny set up really well why this is so important, as we'll talk about. Mountain gorillas are the only great ape on the planet besides us that are increasing. So what can we learn from this rare success story? This is an overview of what I'm going to sort of talk about, just to give you guys a sense of what we're going to cover today, a little bit about the organization I am very lucky to work for, a bit of time talking about what makes gorillas in general, but particularly mountain gorillas special, the lessons we've learned, and then why it is important to conserve gorillas, which I know I don't need to convince any of you about, but it's just something I like to talk about because it's a question I get asked a lot. But before I begin, I really want to honor all of the people that I'm representing in this talk. There are literally thousands of people who have dedicated their lives, and too many of them have lost their lives to protecting gorillas. So this talk is really of me representing their work, and also the many, many funders, including many AZA zoos, who have made this work possible. And I do want to just take a minute to call out many of our biggest supporting zoos. Cleveland Metro Park Zoo, who they serve on our board as well, Columbus Zoo, Dallas Zoo, who served on our board for a long time with under Greg Hudson, Disney's Animal Kingdom, which is on our board, Detroit Zoo serves on our board, Houston Zoo serves on our board, Memphis Zoo, North Carolina Zoo, Oklahoma City Zoo, Omaha Zoo, St. Louis Zoo, and Zoo Atlanta, which has been our home for almost 3 decades now. So we would not be able to do this work without the support of these and many other zoos. And if you don't hear your zoo on that list, please get in touch with someone and let them know that we would love to have them supporting our work. And I also want to give a special thanks to all of you for the work that you do day in and day out to help educate the public about the importance of wildlife and conservation. You know, obviously, the more people know, the more they hopefully care, and it takes a village to do this work. So thank you for the work that you do on behalf of animals and conservation. So just a little gorilla 101. I heard some of the chat in the beginning, and I know not everyone has gorillas at their zoos, but so just wanted to orient us. There are 4 types, 2 species and 4 subspecies of gorillas. So if we start in West Africa, you have the cross river gorillas. I don't know if you guys can see my pointer, but they're a tiny little population up here on the border of Cameroon and Nigeria. Then we have the Western lowland gorillas. These are the gorillas that we're the most familiar with. They're actually the only of the 4 subspecies that are found in zoos. So you won't see any of the other 3 in zoos. And then there are no gorillas kind of here in the center of Africa, but if you come over, we have the eastern species. We have the Growers gorillas, which are actually found only in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then you have the mountain gorillas. There are 2 populations. You can see this here, and they're kind of blown up. They are found in 3 countries, Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so I'm going to be talking mostly about mountain gorillas today. I will touch on Growers gorillas because the Fossey Fund works with both subspecies. We do not currently work with any of the gorillas in West Africa. And just to zoom in a little bit more, so these are the 2 populations of mountain gorillas that I talked to you about. There's one population that's almost entirely in Uganda. They live in what's called windy impenetrable forest. And then you have this population down here. It's called the Virunga population because they inhabit the Virunga volcanoes that are split between Rwanda here, a tiny bit in Uganda, and then a pretty large area in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I'm really going to be talking for the most part about this Virunga population today. So just wanted to orient you before we get into the talk. So hopefully many of you know that a little bit about the founder of my organization, Dian Fossey, who in 1967 broke up with her fiance, got her appendix taken out, and moved to the wilds of Rwanda to study the then unknown, mountain gorillas. She lived up at 10,000 feet in these very remote and hospitable forests. And she initially went there to study the gorillas. Her mandate from Louis Leakey was to study gorillas and learn more about them. And she was actually the first person to habituate gorillas, so to get them very accustomed to her presence and to get to know them as individuals. And as a result, really changed our understanding of gorillas from kind of ferocious, scary beasts to the gentle giants that we know that they are. This is Digit. This is one of her favorite gorillas. And I always say that Dian Fossey quickly did what us scientists are not supposed to do. And that is she fell in love with her subject animal, the gorillas. And Digit, unfortunately, was killed in 1977 by poachers defending his family. And this is when Dian's work really took a turn towards much more what she called active conservation. She started the Digit Fund in Digit's honor so that his life wouldn't go in vain. And the goal of the Digit Fund was to raise money to do anti-poaching patrols and to help protect the habitat, because there was not much being done by the Rwandan government at that point in time. She made a lot of enemies in the process. And for those of you that know her story, she was actually murdered up in her cabin in Rwanda in 1985. So next year will mark the 40th anniversary since her death. But luckily, her work and her story did not die when she did. It was immortalized in the movie Gorillas in the Mist, which came out 3 years after her death and starred Sigourney Weaver. I hope you all have seen it. If not, I would highly recommend it. It is an Oscar-nominated and Golden Globe-winning movie that really tells the story of Dian's work and her fight to save mountain gorillas from extinction. In 1982, the name of the organization was changed from the Digit Fund to the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. So we are her original organization that she started. And these are the humble beginnings in which she began. And we are now the largest and longest running organization doing gorilla conservation in the world. We have a staff of more than 400 people in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo who are the front line of gorilla conservation. They are out in the forest or in the communities 365 days a year working to save gorillas. The areas where we work, just to show you, here in Rwanda, we have worked for 57 years. So this is where Dian started. This is the Rwandan side of that Virunga massive I told you about, or the Virunga region. And about a quarter of a century ago, we expanded to another conservation frontier, which is where the Growers gorillas live, so that other subspecies. And here we're working in an area outside of national parks, because many of the Growers gorillas don't live in national parks, they live in community forests. So we have established a 2,400 square kilometer community forest in between these national parks to help protect these gorillas that formerly didn't have any protection. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I don't have a lot about it in this presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And so our mission is to save gorillas in the ecosystems in which they live through a scientific and very people-centered approach. And the ultimate goal is to create a healthier planet for all, for both wildlife and for humans. And hopefully that'll become apparent as I move through this talk, why we say that. We operate under 4 strategic pillars that are protecting gorillas, conducting critical science, and those are our legacy from Dian Fossey's time. But in the last quarter century, we've really also focused on the human side of conservation. And that work focuses on training the conservationists of today and tomorrow, and also helping to build resilient communities. And what I'd like to do now is have my Rwandan country director, Felix Ndagijimana, tell you a little bit more about that work in his own voice.
The Fossey Gorilla Fund International is dedicated to the conservation and protection of gorillas and their habitats in Africa. To be able to accomplish our mission, we have developed an integrated conservation model which has 4 pillars. The first one is daily protection. Daily protection is done through the presence of our staff in the park. So we have trackers who go to the park 365 days a year. Their work is basically to monitor the gorillas, to follow each and every gorilla groups that we are in charge of. Also, we have 2 dedicated anti-poaching teams who are in the forest also every day, removing snares and other threats to gorillas and other animals of the park. Second one is scientific research. We are the world's longest running research center. We have been studying mountain gorillas for over 50 years. Our research work doesn't focus only on the gorillas, but also biodiversity of the park. So we want to be able to understand the gorillas and their ecosystem. Information that comes out of the research that we do really informs conservation policies in this country. Pillar number 3 is training of future conservation leaders. We're able to reach over 400 students from higher learning institutions in Rwanda. The work that we do is basically to provide skills to young scientists that would really enable them to continue the work of the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. Our 4th pillar is helping communities. This is important because we know effective conservation requires support of local communities. We work closely with communities who live close to the gorilla habitat, and we support their education, health, and also provide alternatives, because some of these communities are affected by poverty and they depend on park resources. So we want to be able to provide alternatives so that they don't go in the park. It is such a great honor to be the first Rwandan director of Keynote Research Center, to follow in the footsteps of Dian Fossey and all these other great scientists, all these other great conservationists. But I'm not the only Rwandan who works at Keynote Research Center. In fact, 98% of all our staff are Rwandan.
So as a result of this work, and obviously the work of the governments in the countries where they live and all of the other partners that are working on the ground, mountain gorillas are the only non-human great ape, because we are great apes as well, whose numbers are increasing. And you can see this is that Virunga population that it reached a low in 250, in the 1980s of 250 individuals. And Dian Fossey actually thought they would be extinct by the year 2000. So it really is an incredible conservation success story. And they are increasing despite what continue to be really significant threats. They have a small population size of only 1,000 individuals. Right now, the Virunga population where we work is at 600, and then that windy population I mentioned is at 400. So when you combine, it's about 1,000 individuals. So not a lot left. They have a very small habitat. It's only about 700 kilometers squared total, and it's surrounded by some of the highest rural population densities in Africa. And these individuals, as Felix mentioned, many of them are poor. They're dependent on forest resources to meet their needs. And really the only direct threat that has gone away since Dian Fossey's time is that people are no longer poaching gorillas directly like they did with Digit. But people do still set snares for wildlife that the gorillas, for other animals like antelope, that the gorillas can unfortunately get caught in. And then there's significant disease risk because gorillas share so much of our DNA. They're very susceptible to human diseases. And with so many people in the area, both human induced and natural diseases like Ebola are a big risk. And then there's regional instability. Rwanda obviously had a genocide 30 years ago. It's a very, very stable country now, but just over the border in Congo, there's been an ongoing civil strife for the last 30 years. And so that obviously makes protecting animals that move across borders quite difficult. And this is just an image to show you kind of what it looks like in Rwanda. So on the right-hand side, you have the human population, farms, 0 buffer zone. And then on the left-hand side, you see that is the forest where the gorillas live. So it's literally these small islands of habitat surrounded by a sea of people going in, gorillas and other wildlife coming out. So very challenging situation on the ground. So we say that the success of mountain gorilla conservation in general is fragile. Even though it is a success story, it's a fragile success story, and they remain a very heavily conservation dependent subspecies. We can't just walk away from them. But the fact that they are increasing, I think, gives us the opportunity to say, what lessons can we learn from mountain gorilla conservation, particularly given that there are still considerable challenges on the ground? You know, what can we learn that maybe might apply to conservation in other areas or with other types of gorillas? So what I'd like to do now is just walk through a number of lessons that I think are important. And I'm not going to go too much into science, but being a scientist, I have to have a little science in here. But also just want to emphasize that science is really an important part of developing conservation strategies. We want strategies that are based on sound science. And why this is important in general is that, and I'm sure all of you know this, is that nature is considered to be in the worst shape in human history, with about 1 million species at risk of extinction. And primates are in particularly bad shape. It's estimated that 60% of primate species are at risk of extinction. And the example I like to use when I'm talking to people is kind of this idea of a Jenga, the Jenga game, in that, you know, as we lose these species, these ecosystems get weakened, and we just don't know when we're going to go too far and ecosystems are going to collapse. And this is really one of the biggest existential threats to our own species, because we need these ecosystems and to do a lot of services for us, like pollinate our food and provide us with rain for water. So it is a big risk, not just to wildlife, but to human populations as well. But before I talk a little bit more about the lessons learned, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the gorillas themselves, because they are absolutely wonderful. And mountain gorillas, because they live at this high elevation of, you know, between 8,000 and 14,000 feet, they're very, very fuzzy, as you can see here. And so I do think they are probably the cutest baby primates on the planet, with all of this crazy hair. They live in very tight-knit families. In fact, they're the only grade 8 species besides our own that live in these very cohesive social groups, not fission fusion like you see in chimpanzees, or more solitary lifestyles like you see in orangutans. The silverback, like you see here, is kind of the center of group life. He is in charge of making a lot of the group decisions. So when a silverback decides that it's time for the group to leave, you can see kind of everyone follows suit. They are the biggest primates on the planet. Male gorillas weigh in at about 400 pounds. And you can see how much that silver mantle is clearly a kind of a very obvious signal and way for his family to keep track of him as they move through the forest. Silverbacks are kind of a central piece of the group. I love this photo. It just shows 2 females who are actually using a silverback as a pillow during a rest session. And you will generally find that the group kind of congregates around them, including babysitting. This is a male who's actually babysitting an orphan who lost its mother. And we find that they will adopt even individuals that are not their biological or genetic offspring. So very, very central and important role within the group. The other strong relationship within the group is obviously between mothers and their infants. So female mountain gorillas give birth around every 4 years. The infants are completely dependent on their moms. If their mom dies before they reach the age of about 2.5, they won't survive. But after that, they can really count on the group to support them, and they generally do okay. And what's really interesting is that at first it was thought that females didn't really form strong relationships with other females, but over the years we've shown that, particularly along matrilines, like you see in a lot of other primates, that quite close relationships can be formed. And this is Umafatawina, who you'll see here. She's got 3 of her offspring with her. She's holding a teeny little baby here, but these are 2 of her daughters that are quite close to her. And then the other, of course, members of the gorilla family are the infants, who I think their job is basically to be adorable and spend a lot of their time just playing and gathering the skills and developing the relationships that they'll need to be successful as adults. Mountain gorillas are vegetarians for the most part, and they live in a pretty unique environment because they live so high up at such high elevations. There's really no fruit available for them. So we always describe them as living in a salad bowl. So food is not a limiting resource. Basically, food is available everywhere. And I say they're almost vegetarians because occasionally we see them eating ants. This is actually a video that just came in from the field last week, which I think is really funny to watch. This is where I feel like they could learn from their tool-using cousins, the chimpanzees, because it doesn't look very comfortable to eat these ants. I think they're getting bitten quite a bit. But they will occasionally seek out ants, but for the most part, they don't hunt like chimpanzees and orangutans and even bonobos do. They're really pretty much strictly vegetarians. And they live in, they're not territorial, but they will share overlapping ranges. This is two families of gorillas that have come together. You can see this male in the background, he's yawning, he's doing this symbolic feeding, and he's about to show off to these males in the foreground who are from a different family. And one of the unique things about mountain gorillas is that they actually can have multiple silverbacks living in a group, which we don't see in the other subspecies generally. And again, we think it's because of this unique environment that they live in where food is very plentiful, and so it doesn't limit their group size the way that you see in some of the other gorilla subspecies. So that's just a little bit about gorillas and their families. I do want to turn now to lessons that we can learn from mountain gorilla conservation. So the first lesson is really that sustained daily protection is the key to conservation success. And we know this from kind of a natural experiment that we were able to do. So I'm just going to walk you through this. But the idea here is that all mountain gorillas have formal protection in that every single mountain gorilla lives in a national park. Okay, so they're all in a park, and these parks are actually pretty well protected. They have 20 times the global average in terms of the number of rangers that are in the park. So not only are all gorillas in parks, but these are pretty well protected parks. They're not just parks on paper only, and these parks have been protected for decades, okay? But interestingly, some gorillas also have an extra level of protection. They have people with them every day checking on them. Some of those people are the staff members at the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. Some of those people are park rangers that are employed by the government. But the idea is that some gorillas have this extra level of protection, while other gorillas are just roaming through the park. They're protected, but they don't have people with them. And we were able to do this natural experiment where we compared the growth rates, if you have protection every day or you don't. And we found that this population increase that we talk about has been almost entirely a result of these gorillas that have the extra protection. So if you look at this chart over here, you'll see that these black bars represent the part of the population with the daily protection. The gray bars are the overall population. So you see this is when it was declining back in the 70s and 80s, and now it's increasing. But these white bars are the population, the part of the population that doesn't have that formal protection. And up until recently, that part of the population has actually been declining. So what this really shows us is having parks alone is not sufficient, even well-protected parks, but we're going to need a lot more resources out there to conserve some endangered species. And I think this is really important to emphasize because when people ask me what one of the biggest challenges of conserving gorillas is, I consistently say it's a lack of funding. We don't have enough money to be doing the work we need to do on the ground, and this really exemplifies that well. The second one is I alluded to earlier is really the value of long-term data and different types of data to make effective conservation decisions. So this is one of my favorite graphics. What you see here, I'm going to pause it for 1 second. So what you see here, each of these different colors represents a different gorilla family. Okay, so we've got 3 families represented right here. I'll show you this. These are the Bosoke and the Karasimbi volcanoes, and Dian Fossey's original camp that was named Karasoke was right in between these two. That's how it got its name, shifting between half of Bosoke and half of Karasimbi. So these are the sort of inherited families from Dian's time, and each dot represents a daily GPS point. So none of these gorillas are collared. We know where they are every day because there are people with them, as we just talked about. And so what you'll see is we're starting back in the early 2000s. So you see these families kind of moving through the park, right? And you can see how they're moving through the park. You'll see them all run down to the edge of the park, and that's when bamboo shoots are in season. They run down there to eat the shoots, and then they move up. But what you notice in 2006 is these families started to split. And now you can see how many more families are inhabiting this area, this relatively small area of park. They can't move out to the east because there are people there. They can't move to the north or to the south because you don't see it, but there are actually other gorilla families there. And right along here, if I can get right along here is the border with Congo. So they do move sometimes into Congo, but we can't track them when they cross the border. So you're not seeing their full ranges. But this is really to give you an idea of how the group density over time has grown. So this graph also shows it. So this is the number of groups that were in the area. You can see it was roughly, the group density was kind of low. And then in 2006, it tripled. And what we saw as a result of this is that the population growth rate plummeted. It stayed positive, so it was still growing, but it was growing at 50% slower rate than before. And this was because these groups kept bumping into each other. You can see it there, how they overlap, and that increased the rate of infanticide, so infants being killed when these families came together. And also it made the inner birth interval, so how frequently females were having babies, get longer. And that's because when these groups would come together, females would kind of check out the males in another group and decide to move. And when females are hopping between groups, they don't get pregnant because they want to wait until they settle down. And so what was interesting is that this was completely driven by social factors. People often ask like, well, as you have more gorillas, were they eating themselves out of house and home? No, it was really these intergroup interactions that slowed the population growth rate down. So combining all of this data together, showing that, as the population of gorillas has grown and the number of groups has grown, but the park has not grown, it's affecting conservation. This has now become the scientific basis for the Rwandan government to undertake a very ambitious project to reclaim portions of the park that were converted to agriculture in the last 30 to 40 years. So their plan is to increase the park by about 25% to make more room for gorillas, being able to really use science to show why this is important, and science collected over a long period of time. Number three, and this is the part for me that's always very exciting as a scientist, is that even after studying these guys for 57 years, they're still constantly surprising us. We still have a lot to learn. So just to orient you again, this is a chart, and you just saw, these are all those gorilla families that you just saw moving around all over the place. And so this is traditionally where the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund has worked. Again, Dian Fossey's original camp was here. These are all the descendant groups from the ones that she started studying in 1967. And you remember I told you that the reason they can't move over here is because there are these gorilla families over here that traditionally have been protected by the Rwandan government, but they've never really been studied. So about 5 years ago, we started working with the government to study these groups and collect data on them the same way we're collecting data down here. And what we found was, I think, absolutely amazing. So these groups are only 17 kilometers apart. I don't know what that would be in miles, 10 miles apart. So they live very close to each other. But what we found is basically they don't eat any of the same foods. So when we look at the top 5 foods, the things that make up 80% of their diet, so what they're eating every day, which would, for me, would be pizza if it was up to me, because I love pizza. We found there was only one species that overlap between the two, okay? So when people say to me, well, what do gorillas eat? My answer is, just like in humans, it depends on where they live. And if you live in the red part of the park, you're eating a lot of gallium. If you live in the blue part of the park, you're eating a lot of ferns and other vegetation. And this has really big implications on the nutritional quality of their food. It can affect how much space a group needs, because if you're eating food that's less nutritious, you might need more space. It can affect how quickly you can reproduce. And so all of these things we're studying now as a result. And it also affects, how the government thinks about park expansion. What plants are you going to plant as you try and rebuild the park? So still lots to learn on these animals that have been studied for a really long time. Another lesson is that gorillas and maybe primates overall are not necessarily good indicators of the health of their ecosystem. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we did a very large collaborative study where we looked at 7 different primate species, and you can kind of see them here. I'm not going to go through them, but a lot in Africa, a couple in Central and South America, one in Madagascar. So these are animals where we had lots of data over a long period of time. And we looked at major climate oscillations. So this is things like an El Nino year, where you either get a ton of rain, or maybe you have a drought and don't get any rain. And we said, what was the effect of this major changes in climate on the primates, on how they survived, how they reproduced, et cetera. And what we found was that mortality, or their survival rate, which is ultimately what had the biggest impact on whether or not their populations grew or shrunk, was little affected by climate change, by this climatic variation. So the conclusion was that primates, because they are so flexible, they have flexible diets, they're really smart, they are much more adaptable probably in the face of climate change than maybe other species that are more specialized, which is great for primates, right? We really would like them to have some buffering from climate change, which we know is a huge threat overall across the globe. But it also tells us that if we're only studying gorillas, we're not really going to know what's happening to their ecosystem as a whole. And maybe we won't find out until it's too late. And so that's why for us, for example, we've really expanded the type of research that we do to not just be on gorillas, but also be on these really key indicator species. So things like key foods such as bamboo, things like frogs, and birds and invertebrates like butterflies, all of which are very sensitive to environmental change. And so by studying them, we can understand, is the gorilla's ecosystem overall healthy? And we know that while gorillas are increasing, for example, amphibians are not doing nearly as well within the environment. So there are changes going on within the environment that we're not picking up through watching the gorillas. Lesson number 5 is that tourism can really play a critical role in conservation. And I want to emphasize this. And I hope maybe some of you have come to see the gorillas. If you haven't, I highly encourage you to. It is a life-changing experience. But I would say for conservation, it is not a cure-all. Excuse me. So ecotourism has played a very critical role in the conservation of mountain gorillas. And I think what a lot of people don't necessarily know is that every year, tourism to see the gorillas is either the top or one of the top sources of foreign revenue for the entire country of Rwanda. It has been a critical part of their economy, of jobs, et cetera, for the community. And I'm going to pause for a second and take a quick sip of water. But it's probably not replicable in a lot of countries, or at least the way Rwanda does it, because Rwanda has incredible infrastructure. It's very safe. It's a very small country, so it's easy to get around. It's got great flight routes into it, and that's just not going to be the case, say, in Democratic Republic of Congo at the moment. I might have to get a cough drop. We'll see if I can keep going here. But it also comes with risks. So when you have to habituate the gorillas, so get them used to people, that can be very stressful for them. There is the risk of disease transmission by having people close to the gorillas. And then also, there are these extreme fluctuations when tourism just completely dries up. So for example, during COVID-19, or if you have a global downturn in the economy, that leaves species, it leaves ecosystems, and it leaves the people that depend on these jobs and these opportunities very vulnerable. And so I think that the message that I always tell people is that tourism is one piece of the puzzle, but we can't have it be the only piece. We really need a diversified approach to funding conservation if we're going to have conservation be successful in the long term. Number 6 is that we must invest in the conservation leaders of the future. This is really critical. In a study that we did recently, looking at this issue of equity and conservation in science, we did an analysis over a 5-year period of publications in ecological journals, scientific publications that were done on African wildlife. And while we found overall the number of studies that were being led by African scientists was increasing, most of these studies were being published in local journals. And if we really looked at top tier journals, so what you would want to publish as an academic in Europe or in the US, only 6% of these were being led by Africans. And again, these are studies on African wildlife. Only 6% were being led by Africans, and 66% had no African co-authors at all. And so again, it's about building that next generation of leaders that are going to be able to tackle the challenges that are they're facing on their continent with their own wildlife. And this is just a general statement that we really need tens of thousands of more PhDs in Africa to be doing this work. And that is why we embarked on an ambitious project that Jenny referenced earlier, and that was to build a state-of-the-art research and educational facility in Rwanda to really take the work that we have been doing in a substandard facility and ratchet it up to be able to do more and to train more people. And I just wanted to show you, it's about a 4-minute video, so hopefully we have time, but a video about this project because we're incredibly proud of it. So you can sort of see it in action. So hopefully this will play, yeah. We are the world's longest running study of gorillas, and actually one of the longest running studies of any animal species. People know us as a gorilla organization, but actually we study the whole ecosystem because really to understand and protect gorillas, we have to know what's happening in their environment. Dian Fossey first started her work here in 1967, and she was located up in the forest. And then in the 90s, the Karasuki Research Center that she established was destroyed. And since that time, our organization has been working out of Musanze town. So every day our teams come up to the edge of the forest and drive back. It was an office building, so it didn't have labs, it didn't have classrooms. And we really wanted to be thinking, you know, to the future. What else did we want to be doing? How could we bring more students on site? We just didn't have the space to do that where we were. We were incredibly lucky to be introduced to Mass Design Group to work alongside designers and thinking about, you know, how is this campus going to be built into the landscape? How is it going to really reflect the mission and the goals of the Fossey Fund? A month after we broke ground, COVID-19 hit.
We've gone through some really challenging times, but we look forward to moving ahead with the construction of the new campus.
What more can you do? What can you do in this time to serve others and help others?
In 52 years, this organization has never left its mission, no matter what.
So to see the work that's actually happening in spite of COVID is phenomenal.
This campus is going to be an absolute game changer. It's truly incredible. Foundations have been poured and building is happening. So right now, 500 local people come to the construction site every day to work.
We have put over 250,000 native plants in the campus grounds. And the idea there is to really make this whole place become a living laboratory.
I feel like however much people would say that we've made progress in Rwanda in general, both including women in all sorts of trade, is groundbreaking.
I think what's interesting is how the design managed to use the volcanic stone amakoro, which is a disregarded often material locally.
Today, we have just received keys to the campus from the Mass Design Group. So officially, this is now our campus. It's a day that we have been looking forward to for so many years. So it's very exciting that we're now here.
This campus will make the people that already love the gorilla and work happier and prouder and more inspired because, come on, look at this place. Who would not want to work from here?
already work with hundreds of students every year, but now this campus, we have more lab space, we have more classroom space, we have a library, we have a computer lab. It's really set up to enable us to teach, do a better job of really training that next generation of conservationists. So we kind of think of it as like a little mini conservation university, and I can't wait till we have more students on site here and they get to learn in this incredible space.
Mass's belief that, beauty is justice, and the beauty that you have brought to this campus is making people stop. People that maybe didn't see us before and say, something important is happening on site here. And we're so incredibly grateful for that. And it's not just important for the Fossey Fund, it's important for the region, and ultimately it's important for the world.
You guys will be happy to know I got a cough drop, so hopefully I'll be okay now. So yeah, we're incredibly proud of this project, and it was really important to us that it didn't just have impact once it was open, but through the entire process it had impact, as you heard in that video. And because we're a scientific organization, we studied this. We just did a study 2 years post-opening, and I wanted to share some of the stats with you from that. We had 5 key areas that we focused on throughout the project. From an economy standpoint, it created 2,400 jobs during that COVID time. And when we look 2 years later, people's income is 50% higher than it was before the project started. We did 130 trainings on site, and almost 600 people received certifications in things like plumbing and masonry or electrical works that enabled them to continue on. And right now, I think 45% of the workers are still employed in construction, which is 3 times the national average. Equity was really important to us. 25% of the leadership and 25% of the construction workforce was female. The environment, as you heard us mention, we planted 250,000 native plants to bring back forests to this agricultural land. And we found that even 2 years after the project, 100% of the people we surveyed believed in the importance of conserving the park. And this ties into lesson 7, which is the importance of community in conservation, and that these partnerships are community-led and they're crucial to the work that we do. And I put this quote in there because I think it's really important to emphasize that it can't be us telling communities what they need, but listening to communities, hearing what's important to them and implementing that. And this is one of my favorite quotes. This is from our communities in Congo, who told us that one of the most important things that we have brought to them is enable their children to go to school, because that's such a critical thing that often they are not able to do. And so we work on the reason that people are still dependent on forest resources to improve their food security, so diversifying their agriculture, to help with livelihood development. These are women that were taught to sew, and so that they could sew for both their families as well as to make a living. Literacy training, where we work in Congo, basically no one has had even the opportunity to go to primary school, particularly women. So basic literacy skills so they can be eligible for jobs. And also a ton of work within schools. And this is one of my favorite projects. We work with 25 schools around the park in Rwanda. These are nature clubs. And every nature club has to do projects that are good for the school, good for the community, and good for the environment. So a lot of them do tree nurseries, and these kids have distributed over 80,000 trees in their community that are helping with food security, erosion control, and biodiversity return. And so our focus on youth and adult education, as well as food security and livelihood works, touches about 30,000 people annually. And it's why our mission is, we say our mission and our tagline is helping people, saving gorillas, because we know ultimately for gorillas to thrive, people have to thrive as well. And one of the ways I like to talk about this with people is that maybe, but one of the reasons this is particularly important is that scientists estimate that in the next 20 years, we're going to lose 50% of the remaining great apes. And we already know that all of these animals are either endangered or critically endangered. Growers gorillas, the ones that we work with in Eastern Congo, are actually considered the most at risk of all of the great apes. And that's because 60% of them have disappeared in the last 20 years, mostly as a result of hunting for people to feed themselves. And so I told you earlier, we expanded to work in Eastern Congo in this Nkuba conservation area. And this is a 25-year relationship between us and the local communities to protect their forests, their biodiversity, and their cultural heritage, because these forests are really important to them. It started at 700 square kilometers. It's now 2,400 square kilometers. So it's 15 times the size of the whole park that's left in Rwanda. And it has really become a model in Eastern Congo, which is a very challenging place to work for how you do effective community-driven conservation outside of these formal protected areas. And what I think is really interesting is when you look at how many people are protecting, I told you before that where the mountain gorillas are, we have really high levels of protection, 50 trackers per square kilometer. And in Nkuba, we only have 4 trackers per square kilometer. And part of that is because the community is benefiting from the forest. They're not being excluded from it, but they're benefiting from it. And so that enables us to have fewer people on the ground because the community has bought in that protecting this forest is really important. And then lesson number 8 is that modern day conservation is about a lot more than saving a species. Hopefully that's become apparent through what I just said. But one of the things I talk about a lot are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals that have been put together for a prosperous future for both the planet and for people. And one of those goals is life on land. So that's biodiversity conservation. And that's certainly something we do. But our work actually touches on 9 of these 17 goals. So no poverty, zero hunger, quality education, gender equality, providing jobs. These are all areas in which conservationists work. And I think it's a really important thing to talk about this larger impact that we have beyond saving a species, which is already so important already. And by creating these community protected areas like the one I just told you about in Congo, we are literally sustaining the lungs of the planet, saving biodiversity, preserving livelihoods and cultural heritage, and contributing to the larger effort to protect 30% of the earth by the year 2030. Big shoes to fill. So I want to just end this talk quickly with talking about why save gorillas. And again, I know for this audience, you know why it's important, but a lot of people say to me, Tara, with so many challenges we're facing on the planet, why is saving gorillas matter? And for me, it really boils down to 3 simple reasons. First, because they need us. We've talked about how they are some of the world's most at-risk species, primarily because of our behavior. And so they need us to be protecting them. But also because we need them. They live in the Congo Basin. As I just mentioned, these are the literal lungs of the planet. They're one of our best natural defenses against climate change, and unfortunately, they're disappearing. And you can think of gorillas and the other animals as kind of the gardeners of these forests. And so when we protect gorillas, we're protecting their forests, we're helping to keep those forests healthy, and ultimately, that's helping to save our own species. And then finally, because they deserve it. They share 90% of our DNA, and they share many elements of our common humanity. Just like us, they form friendships that can last lifetimes. They take care of their most vulnerable, and they mourn the loss of a family member. And I think this is really well exemplified by the story of Fasha. This is Fasha. She lives in one of the families that we protect on a daily basis. And so one of the days when our trackers went out, we check on every gorilla in the family. So just like when you go home, you check on whoever you may share your home with, your pets, your partner, your kids, your grandchildren. We check on every gorilla. And so we noticed that Fasha was missing and that her family had encountered snares. And when we found Fasha, she actually was caught in a snare that had been set for antelope, and it was tightly wound around her ankle. The snare was removed, but unfortunately her foot was pretty badly damaged. And a few weeks later, when we were with the group, we noticed that as they tried to cross the river, Fasha kind of held back, maybe because her foot wasn't fully healed. And so her sister waited for her on the other side of the river, holding out her arm in encouragement. And when Fasha finally made it across, giving her this huge bear hug to reassure her, as you can imagine we would do. And kind of when the camera pulled back, you can see that Fasha's entire family was waiting for her as well. And so I think we all think all species should be conserved. Gorillas certainly are particularly special for these stories like Fasha's and the many others that we see on a daily basis. And so with that, I want to thank you so much for your time and for inviting me here to speak with you tonight. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about gorillas, about our work, or about anything else. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, thank you. This is Ellen. I just want to thank Dr. Stoinski. That was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciated it. And just because we have 112 people online, if you would enter your question in the chat, we will not have people speak over each other. So just please enter your questions in the chat for Dr. Stoinski. Thank you. So our first question that we have is from Barry Borsky. Pardon me, Sue Goldberg. Did gorilla doctors get involved in helping the ensnared gorilla?
Yes, excellent question. And yes, they did. I always say we're kind of the eyes and the ears in the forest. We're out there every day. So if an animal's sick or if they're caught in a snare, we'll then notify the park authorities as well as gorilla doctors. And yes, gorilla doctors did remove the cautious snare. Excellent call.
Okay. We have a question from Maureen Chambers from Louisville Zoo. She asks, is there a reason only Western lowland gorillas are in zoos?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I'm sure you guys know, zoos have not taken gorillas out of the wild since the 70s. And there were some mountain gorillas that were in zoos. I think a lot of it has to do with the traditional trade routes and sort of coming out of West Africa. Mountain gorillas weren't even discovered to Western outside of Africa until 1902. There were only a few of them that were brought into zoos. They didn't survive very well. And so then, zoos didn't want to be contributing any further to gorilla numbers decreasing in the wild. And so they just focused on the ones where there was a large enough population to make it sustainable in the long term.
Thank you. Eric Swartz from Phoenix Zoo asks, are they being affected by coltan mining runoff in the Congo, and are they close to that?
A great question. And yes, the Growers gorillas that I mentioned that are considered the most at risk of all the great apes, it's exactly for that reason. I mean, it's extreme poverty, but also mining that's happening in those forests and people that are out in the forest, and there are no grocery stores in the forest. And so people hunt to feed themselves, and that's what's happening there, is that they're being killed primarily for food. But yeah, and one of the reasons that we want to get these forests in the Eastern Congo protected now is that as extractive industries, more of them move in, because it has been such a challenging place and there's 100 rebel groups that are moving through those forests, we haven't had large scale deforestation. But at some point, when Congo, when stability comes to that region, it's incredibly mineral rich. And those minerals are things that we actually need to make our economy more green. Those are minerals that are used in cell phones, in electric car batteries, in wind turbines. So getting these forests protected now and getting them to have economic value now for being standing forests rather than for extractive forests is really critically important. That's a great question. Other questions from anyone?
Okay, Ann Pisani from Kansas City asked about how will the government keep local buy-in if parklands are reclaimed for agriculture?
Great question. And the government has been doing a lot of due diligence on that. I should mention that as part of the ecotourism program in Rwanda, the local communities, 10% of the revenue that is gained is shared with local communities. And so the government will be doing a lot of research on that. People will be compensated for their land. They're also looking at building what they call model villages. So where the way that people are living adjacent to the park is not really the most space efficient. And also agricultural yields are decreasing. So communities that, in the long term, if that situation around the park doesn't change, communities are going to be worse off. So they're looking at, what is job creation opportunities, bringing people where they have access to running water, they have access to good healthcare, they have access to schools, compensating people for their land. A lot of those strategies are being put into place as the government's doing their research on this. It's a great question.
Thank you. And related to that, Patricia Conkle asks, if the gorillas have no place to move due to group density and shrinking habitat loss, don't they run the risk of inbreeding?
It's a great question. And actually mountain gorillas are already very inbred. They're the most inbred, I think, of all of the gorilla subspecies. And again, remember that population was down to only 250 individuals. One of the benefits, to be honest with you, of the increased group density is that, remember, these groups are bumping into each other more, and it's giving females more opportunities to move between groups. And so that can actually increase diversity by giving them more opportunities to breed over, with different families. When the population density was so low, like it was back in the 80s, groups rarely ran into each other. And so sometimes females, would stay in their family for their entire life. Usually because there's multiple males, they can find someone in the group to breed with that's not a close relative. But we've found over time that paternal siblings don't really distinguish each other. Maternal siblings do, mothers and sons, and fathers and daughters, but it's hard for paternal siblings to recognize that they're related to each other.
Donald Davidson from Topeka asks, when the COVID epidemic was rampant, did it pass to any of the gorillas?
Excellent question. And I will say that, that was an incredibly challenging time for us because we did not know what COVID was going to look like in the gorillas. And, we know that in chimpanzees in Uganda, for example, a simple cold virus can cause a major outbreak and lead to deaths, and it has done that. So we didn't know if COVID was going to act like it did in humans, or if we were going to see a different reaction in the gorillas. We changed all of our protocols on the ground. Our teams, which normally go in and out of the forest every day, were put into quarantine and then put in isolation camps. They were not allowed to be with their families for weeks at a time. We didn't impose this on them. They very much wanted to do this. And I just remember at the beginning of COVID, when we didn't really know that much about it, how we all just wanted to be, I just wanted to be at home with my family. And I think it was incredibly brave of the trackers to be away from their families, to isolate, to protect the gorillas. We don't know of any COVID that hit wild populations of gorillas. We do know that it went through some zoos. In fact, at Zoo Atlanta, a number of the gorillas had COVID. And luckily, the reaction was very similar to what we see in humans, where most animals were fine. Some of the animals that already had pre-existing health conditions, did get a little bit sicker, but no gorillas died. We can't guarantee that that would be the situation in the wild because obviously the gorillas don't have the same level of health care. It's also just a more stressful environment. But it was very reassuring to know that at least in the zoo gorillas, it seemed to not be a particularly lethal respiratory virus.
Thank you, Dr. Stoinski. We have reached the end of our time with you. We want to say we really appreciate you giving your time to share all your knowledge with us. We have a lot of positive comments in the chat. We have all learned a lot, and we promise to bring it out to the guests that we interact with at our zoos and aquariums. And we just thank you for being so generous with your time and expertise and knowledge. So we do appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys again for having me, and thank you for all that you do, as I said, on behalf of wildlife and wild places. I appreciate the opportunity to share, our organization with you.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll be tuning out now, and we will be in touch regarding the rest of our conference. We have our business meeting and then a day of presentations in the first part of October. So thank you all. Appreciate you. And we will be seeing you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.